This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with hosts Ben Pratt. Thanks for joining us.
Understanding how your feet grip, how your pelvis is in neutral, allowing the glutes to activate, rotating the legs outward, creating torque in the hips, and then pulling the ribs down, rotating the shoulders in the head position.
Hello and welcome to another Fit to Succeed podcast. I'm really excited today to have the co-founder of the business startup company MoveU over in the US. His name is Andrew Dettelbach. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today.
What's happening, guys?
Hey,
it's awesome to be here.
It's really great to have you here as well. And I'm excited to talk to you today because I've been watching your growth over the last year or so and the endless and the exciting videos you guys put out on Instagram. So it's going to be great to explore your mind and draw on some of your knowledge, Andrew.
Totally. Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. I have a shirt on. Look at that. For those of you watching.
That's a good point. We're so used to seeing you as the shirtless dude on MoveU.
Let's get fired away.
Indeed. Now, I looked a little bit into your history, Andrew, and I can see that you studied kinesiology. That was where you did your degree. Was there anything prior to that got you interested in human movement?
I like how you said kinesiology.
How do you say it?
We say kinesiology.
Kinesiology. I'll work with you on that one. Kinesiology. So what started your interest then in human movement prior to kinesiology?
Oh man, I think it was, so I went into college wanting to go into psychology. And when I realized I got C's in my 2 or 3 psychology classes. And I was like, this is not working. I need to do another avenue because I'm clearly not connecting with this information. And so I looked into other majors and I was already into fitness, working out. My mom was diagnosed pre-diabetic probably 5 years prior to that. So when that happened, a lot of eating habits and exercise habits changed in the household. And I started to get really into fitness. And I went to college wanting to go to psychology. That wasn't working out. So I chose kinesiology and I just absolutely crushed that major. I went into all kinds of little extracurricular things in that major. I even did 2 years of cadaver dissection for my undergrad, which was insanely rare. It's not possible any other school in the United States. So for an undergrad. And I just really dove into that system, but there was going through the kines major, I didn't necessarily get all the information about movement. They teach you a lot about the body and physics and biomechanics and exercise physiology, but it's not really necessarily applicable. So I injured myself at the end, during finals, I destroyed my lower back. That's when that happened. During my finals, I was in school for 5 years. And I herniated my...
That's no fun when you're prepping for exams, is it?
Exactly. I did crush it. I got A's on everything, but it's brutal. So I don't know if you want to get into that right now, my injury and all that stuff, unless you got some other questions.
No, that would be interesting. I'm sure you've probably talked it quite a few times, but obviously, you're somebody who was studying kinesiology. In theory, should have a pretty good understanding of the body and how it moved and how it worked. Can you sort of pinpoint, is there any particular thing you think may have caused you to have that injury? Or was it a sudden traumatic episode?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I had the 10 millimeter L4, L5 herniation. For those of you that don't know what that means, it means the disc in my back exploded and was pushing into my spine. It hurts, sciatica. It was about 1.5 years of that. But I used to always say that it was me sitting in bed coughing for a week, like serious chest cold, and I was lying in bed studying, and I felt a pop in my back, and that's what originally bulged the disc. It did actually herniate a few months later, but that's what originally bulged. And I was like, it was me coughing, and it was like the worst story ever to tell people. And as I learned more about the body and how I moved and how disconnected I was with my movement, I realized that it was actually my complete lack of control in every exercise I ever did, from pull-ups to push-ups to planks, squats, deadlifts. everything I did, my core was disengaged. So as a result, you get the injury. But it's always like people say, I did this deadlift, I did this squat, this is what did it. I had a guy say, my back hurts, I was combing my hair and a rib popped out. I'm like, it's not you combing your hair that popped the rib out. It's not coughing that did it. It's all the stuff that led up to it.
So what you're sort of saying there, Andrew, is that whilst you had that cough and that perhaps repetitive over several days, that was really the straw that broke the camel's back. You already had some problems in the way in which you moved, and it just required something as low level as a cough to actually throw you back out. Is that what you're saying?
Yep, you got it. That's the key. Straw that broke the camel's back. It's it, and that's what most people attach it to, but they don't focus on the big picture, which is all the stuff that happened the years leading up to it.
Now that's kind of interesting. I'd love to maybe explore that if we can just a little bit. Looking at your past training history, it would be nice maybe to compare that a little bit further in the interview with what you think is good now. But was there anything you think you could have done looking back to maybe have prevented you experiencing that injury?
Oh my gosh, everything that I've learned and everything we teach in our Instagram, everything we teach in our online program, all of that stuff is what would prevented my injury in the first place. It's just at the time I thought I knew everything, and I know now that I have so much more to learn. I always will. And people would give me advice on things and I'd kind of shrug it off. They don't know what they're talking about. Like, I'm bigger. I was 225 pounds then. I was doing more like bodybuilding style exercises, kind of dabbling in high intensity interval training. But I was getting big, and I had like massive chest and shoulders and arms and everything. My legs were kind of wimpy. But,
so the traditional bodybuilder then, eh? The
traditional.
The guy who forgets to train his legs because the beach muscles are more important.
Exactly. And then moving into post-injury and what I do now, I do CrossFit now, and I'm not doing my own regimen. I'm actually following another coach's programming, but it's brilliant. And I love what they're doing. And I've been following CrossFit coaches that are very technical and focus on fundamental movements, not just the traditional
workout of the day type thing. That
exactly.
pushes you hard.
Exactly. So that's made a massive difference. My body looks very different. It's the same weight. So
you're still the same weight, you said?
Same weight. So yeah, 225. After my injury, I got down to 185.
Right. I see. And in terms of that weight that you've regained, I'm assuming you've done a bit more on the legs. I've seen your legs in the videos. They look pretty strong now.
Yeah. So my legs definitely beefed up more, and my upper body is not as big as it was, but I think it looks more natural. It's not like I'm trying to just pump out reps and make a certain muscle look bigger. That's not my goal anymore.
So I'm assuming then, if you've got a coach and people then to assist and to help you, that coaches periodize their programming. There's a much more clear objective in mind than just let's get big.
Exactly. So this generally they program it in blocks of time. So I think it's been a month and a half. Right now we're focusing a lot more on the cardio, high repetitious movements. But the stuff they're programming, a lot of carries mixed in with some Olympic lifting, which is just, I think it's great. Having those carries in there is not common in a lot of CrossFit gyms. So stuff like that's amazing. And then they'll probably go into more like a squatting phase. Let's work on power output for squats, so forth. Cool.
Now, let's just talk a little bit more about your history, because when you went and did your degree, you were fortunate to have Dr. Mike Wasilisin as one of your professors. Is that how we pronounce his surname?
Wasilisin, yeah. He's got lots of S's and I's.
There is. So he was one of your tutors, I believe, towards the end of the degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it was one of my favorite classes next to my cadaver dissection class, which was just unreal.
I bet that was fascinating.
Just 2 years, very slow, going layer by layer. You learned a ton.
So how did that change your perspective then, studying under Mike? How did that change your perspective of movement at the time? Do you remember?
Totally. I learned so much more about the body and movement from him, actually, than I did from all the other classes. So he had a manual therapy and stretch massage technique class. And it was when he first came in, he's an adjunct faculty, so he only did it for 2 semesters. And he's just a lot of fun. It wasn't so focused on testing. It was more on application and practical use. So the fact that we were going around the room and we'd find the origin and insertion of a muscle, and we learned how to stretch it and do more like, we call it active release technique type stuff.
Yep.
And following that pattern, I learned so much about how the body moves and what's best. And it's, in the last 5 years since then, I think that he's learned more from me about those movement patterns now. But that was really what launched me into like thinking about how movement. It was the end of that year that I injured my back, so I wasn't fully there with it, and neither was he actually.
So that's kind of interesting, because I could be wrong, but my assumption here is that you came much more from the practical training background into the study of movement, whereas perhaps he came more from the therapy chiropractic background, and then you've brought him into the training and fitness side of things. Is that correct?
You got it. So he was definitely focused on treating the patients as quickly as possible. 6 visits, you're going to be rocking, 8 visits, and that just isn't how the body works. And it took us 3 years to figure that out, because I was just following along with really what the stuff that he was saying. We were going along, and he was following what the traditional chiropractic and PT route is. Get them better as fast as you can in the amount of time that the insurance companies will allow. And everything's based off of insurance, which is
I see. So
and in the States,
stuck in a medical sort of financial model, really.
And that's where most people are in the U.S. anyway. They're stuck in this model of, you're paying a massive amount for your insurance. Like, you want to use your insurance to get coverage. You don't want to pay out of pocket and pay for insurance. So it was really a trap for a lot of people, because then they'd get stuck with going doctor to doctor for 6 visits at a time, 12 visits at a time. And there's no way you're going to make a change in your body seeing a doctor 12 hours total. It's not possible.
Well, I think what's really interesting is what I'm observing from what you're saying there, Andrew, is that you went from a system where people were reliant upon the practitioner or the expert to help them, to what appears now to be a system where you're trying to empower the individuals to take care of themselves by utilizing and applying knowledge.
Correct. Yeah, that's interesting. I get people in our program that thank me all the time. They're like, "You're giving me my life back." I'm like, "No, I'm not doing anything. I made a program. I wrote a guide. You're the one that put in the work for 7 days a week, 1 to 2 hours a day for the last 6, 7, 8 months. Like, you're the one that did this. You just followed my guide. Like, I don't want to take away their success. I would never take that on them as myself."
Sure. No, that's very humble of you, and that's fantastic. But there is something important, and the people feel a lot of joy when they feel that they've got the power to control whether they're in pain or not.
Exactly. And they stop going to their traditional chiro, PT. They don't go to the doctor as much. A lot of it is down to mindset. It's not just a movement piece. There's a lot of fear that goes along with pain that is unnecessary.
Yeah. I totally agree, but that could be a whole discussion of itself.
Yes.
So
yes,
I'd love to get a little
coaching call for about an hour and a half today with the group on that subject.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah, I bet. That sort of pain avoidance and the compensations and the fear that, like you said, the people have because of pain can be such a debilitating factor, to be honest.
Yo, totally. All pain is coming from the brain. So with negative thoughts comes more pain.
Yeah, I totally agree. I wonder whether we could just, because we had a bit of a nice introduction there to yourself and a little bit about Dr. Mike and how you've influenced one another to come up with the MoveU system.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could maybe just draw a little bit upon your knowledge of some elements of what you do. So let me start by asking how you would define the core muscles of the body. And then we might take that little bit of knowledge and go where that takes us. So
cool. So I'll start off by first saying that my injury was what taught me the most about movement above anything else. So really having that pain there to tell me when things are off, when I'm not moving correctly, is actually very empowering. It's a very useful tool to have. Pain is helpful. So with that, I found that, cool, I could turn on my abdominals, I could turn on my glutes, but there was still an issue. So I would say that the core is everything from the scap, the trapezius muscles, the lats, the abdominals, transverse, obliques, the glutes, the pelvic floor, and the hip flexors. I'd say all that together is your core. And if you just turn on your abdominals and you're doing core bracing and such through the core, the traditional core around the abdominals and obliques and all that, you're still missing the rest of the tension, which is going to be the shoulders being pulled down, rotated into the right position, the lats engaged, the trapezius engaged, and then the glutes, keeping the pelvis steady. All that stuff, I would say, is the core.
Okay, that's really interesting, because you've listed there an awful lot of the muscles that typically...
Most of the body.
But also you've listed typically a lot of the muscles that are attached to the spine, per se, if that's a... I want to just pause the recording for a second, because my son has just whipped on his music, so let me just pause. So from what I can understand there, Andrew, you're suggesting that the core is all of the muscles primarily that attach to the spine itself. Would that be correct?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
You can't just work on like 50% of the spine, which is traditionally what people would consider the core. It's not how it's going to work. There's a lot of laxity elsewhere in the spine. Not going to generate enough force that way.
Because there's definitely some unusual ones you picked out there that people wouldn't typically think of. Like, not many people think of the pelvic floor, even though it is actually attached to the lower part of the spine. People don't typically think of the latissimus dorsi or the trapezius as being muscles that may have a role in the core. Even, you even suggested there with that idea of rotating the scapula back, that things like subscapularis, they're part of the core. How do you sort of share that concept or idea with people to help them understand that these muscles all form part of the core?
I don't think I get that technical with it. We generally try to keep everything as simple as possible. And we talk about these 6 checkpoints that people need to do. We say that in pretty much every video. You've got to have understanding how your feet grip, how your pelvis is in neutral, allowing the glutes to activate, rotating the legs outward, creating torque in the hips, and then pulling the ribs down, rotating the shoulders in the head position. Keeping those in line, you're going to engage all of the muscles of the core. So when you learn how to get the blade into position, you've got the ribs pulled into the right position, your pelvis is neutral, you're pretty much good to go. And a lot of people just don't have a clue how to engage their glutes at all. That is one thing that we found is pretty gnarly. People say, oh, I do squats and deadlifts, all this stuff to get the glutes going, and it engages a little bit, but they're not connected with their glute engagement at all. So when you get that going, they realize, wow, my core, my pelvis, everything's a lot more stable, and I generate so much more power when I can actually think about how to connect with my glute and use it with every repetition of whatever you're doing in life.
Yeah, I find that interesting, because in the work that I've done with clients over the years, I would really agree. I think quite often there isn't a conscious connection with being able to activate those muscles. And what I've typically found is that as somebody maybe squats or lunges or does those sorts of things, those muscles can be activated when focused on, but injury doesn't happen when people are consciously thinking. Injury happens in moments of subconscious control of movement, where perhaps the firing sequences of muscles are out of sync or are delayed. So kind of the way I've typically described it is that the glutes tend to fire in a delayed pattern compared to other muscles. How does that sit with the way you look at it?
100%. Because you get the general quad drivers coming out of a squat. They'll use their quads first, foremost, and then they'll follow through with the glutes and hamstrings, and there's just a misfiring, whereas you could utilize them both at the same time. I think people get stressed out about this idea of keeping things active throughout their day, even when they're not exercising. And they're like, how am I going to remember all this stuff? And it really does get easy. It's just like, I was listening to a podcast with Joe Rogan. It was a sleep podcast. He was talking about how martial artists, or when you think about tying your shoes, you can't really remember how you tie your shoes. Like if you try to conceptualize how to tie your shoe, you may not even remember how to do it. You just do it now. It becomes an innate response. Same thing with martial arts, playing the piano, guitar. When you get really good at it, it just happens. And that's really what's happened to my body and what's happening to a lot of other people's bodies that we talk to. It just starts happening.
Excellent. So to put that into context, you're saying is you're taking people from a point where they have to maybe initially consciously control certain parts of their body, but through practice and repetition, they move towards a point where those things are happening subconsciously because it's become habit.
Exactly. You got it.
No, fantastic. And I think that's such an important point to raise here when we think about injury awareness or, being able to move without pain. We need to be able to do that in a way that does not compromise the automatic requirements of the nervous system. The nervous system has to control us without us having to think about it.
Or else you're not going to get your work done. You're not going to.
Yeah, exactly. Or we might be safe in the gym, but then we go out onto the sports field and now we're not thinking about it because we're playing the game. And then we get injured on the sports field because we only ever consciously control that motion, if that makes sense.
And the thing is, we're only in the gym 1 or 2 hours at a time, most of us, if that. And you've got the rest of the day where you can work on these positions and it'll carry over into your sport, whatever that is. You've got 16 or so hours a day you can work on these motions.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder, you mentioned there about that you guys try very hard to keep things as simple as possible. And this is probably a tough question to answer, but it'd be great to get 1 or 2 thoughts in this direction anyway, which is how the hips and the shoulders and helping those parts of the body to function well can have an impact on good back function.
So the hips and shoulders, they should be able to fully rotate into different positions. So the hips should be able to rotate externally, internally, flexion, extension, big range of motion as possible. Same thing with the shoulder. Now, if the shoulder blade is not functioning properly, which is the case for most people, they're unable to scoop that shoulder blade. They're not going to have the full shoulder flexion, range of motion. So what do? You press overhead, you do something overhead, you throw overhead, you can't get full range of motion, so you're going to extend the spine. And the same thing with the hip. If you're limited in range of motion or your hips are always internally rotated, which is the case for most people, people's knees point inward toward each other, their valgus collapse. Well, you're limited in this external rotation, so then your spine is going to have to make up for that.
Right.
That in that rotation, or your knee or your ankle, whichever you get, wherever you get your injury is probably where your body is making up the lack of rotation elsewhere.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So the hips and the shoulders should be very mobile joints, but if they are limited in mobility, the body tries to steal that motion from somewhere else, like the spine.
Like the lower back, which is not necessarily a mobile joint. It doesn't rotate very well. So that's where most herniations happen. They are generally a flexion rotation.
Yeah.
So,
and as I understand it, the lumbar particularly being, as you suggested, the place where most injury happens, because it doesn't have ribs to lock it down. And so it has the ability to move, or be forced is probably a better word, to be forced into movement more easily than like the thoracic spine.
Thoracic spine, for sure. Thoracic spine's tight for most people, which is another one. If you're unable to rotate through the thoracic spine, well, then your shoulders got to make up for the range of motion, your spine, your hips, your knees. And that's the case for most people. From sitting at the computers all day, shoulders round forward, and then they're locked down. They cannot rotate. Your body's going to make up for that rotation somewhere else. And if you're playing sports, soccer, football, however you want to say it.
We can go soccer. That's fine.
Whatever rotational sport you're doing, your body's going to make up for it elsewhere. And that's where the injuries are generally going to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think that's a really powerful concept, because most people will maybe, go and see their doctor and say, I've hurt my knee, and they expect the doctor to look and be addressing the knee. But you're suggesting actually the doctor could do well by having a look at the hips or the low back and see what's going on.
And that's the issue with the traditional model that we're finding, and so many other movement experts are finding, is that the traditional model is to focus on the injured area, the symptom. How can we make that symptom go away as quickly as possible? You can give them drugs. You can try to do a surgery. You can do some PT around the knee. You're like, I have injured meniscus. Let's work on strengthening the VMO, the inside quadricep muscle, by doing extension exercises with the knee. Well, those aren't what stabilize the knee necessarily. It's going to be your hip, the glute, and the foot that are going to stabilize the knee into the right position. There's nothing you can do without those two active that's going to stabilize the knee.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. I think as well, it would be interesting here, now that we've kind of began to throw this concept around of trying to look at a broader fix, not just a symptomatic fix. Is there anything that perhaps the listeners could do, if there's any of those listeners maybe who have, non-specific low back pain, any basic simple tests or movements you could suggest for them to self-assess their back function?
So yeah, we do pelvic tilts is one thing. I don't know if you want me to show in the video right now.
It's up to you. You're welcome to if you want to or not.
So people on the podcast are going to miss out. But so a simple test for people is can they do pelvic tilts just isolating the pelvis? Mm-hmm. People tend to want, as they tilt the pelvis, and for those of you that aren't watching, you mean arch the back and then flatten the back by tilting the pelvis forward and back. A lot of people will use the upper body, so the ribs will flare out, and they'll be moving the whole spine.
Right.
Or they'll try and glide forward and back. They do this gliding motion because they can't get this rotation here.
So you want the pelvis to tilt on the spot, like without moving forwards or backwards, right?
Just the pelvis tilting there. If you can't do that, or if the range is very limited, say you only move a tiny bit, like a few centimeters versus, oh my gosh, I was trying to do, what is it, inches?
Yeah, you can do centimeters, that's fine, inches, whatever.
So as much movement as you can with the pelvis, without the upper or the lower body moving, without gliding back and forth, can you twist around your hip joints there? Imagine you got a rod going through your hips. Can you twist around that?
Okay. So from what if we could just summarize there for the listeners. So what you're saying is for them to test how well they can pivot on the spot, forwards or backwards. And you're suggesting there that if they're limited, as in they can't tilt forwards or backwards very well, there could be a problem. Or if they find that there's too much movement in one direction and not enough in another.
Correct. And that's where, again, the body is going to make up for that lack of movement elsewhere, which is generally the spine. You're going to start to round the spine when you go to pick things up, or you're going to extend the spine in whatever movement you're doing, rotating the spine. There's a bunch of other tests that could be done. That's first and foremost one of the most limiting things for people that's easy to start working with. And the way to correct it is to just keep doing it. You can do it seated. You do it lying down, standing, do it at a coffee shop, wherever.
To actually to engage and actually do some pelvic tilts on a regular basis to try and improve that motion. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Because again, if you want to get into stretching versus strengthening, stretching, you can stretch the lower back, stretch the hips, all you want. But if you're not putting strength behind it to keep the pelvis there, then it's going to go right back to where it was.
Yeah.
So doing that activation, strengthening around the pelvic tilts is going to hold it there over time.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that for sure. I mean, flexibility is always a temporary thing because all you're doing is shutting down the nervous system a little bit so the muscle lengthens. And if nothing else is done to strengthen, as you suggest, then the nervous system will just say, well, I have to be able to control this motion, and it'll just tighten right back up again.
Yep, you wake up the next morning, you're like, oh, it's back.
It's back, yeah, absolutely. So stretching can be a temporary relief, but like you said, it needs to be immediately followed up with some strengthening work in the areas that are not doing their job.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's spot on. I really like that. I appreciate you breaking out the shirt and showing us those pelvic tilts. That's fantastic. Now I feel I can tag this video with MoveU shirtless dude. You know,
there it is,
which is great. We're almost coming up on time on this main interview. I wanted to ask you just two more questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
I know that you suggested to me beforehand that you're quite into sort of the mindset and psychology a little bit earlier in the interview. What role do you think it plays in the long-term management of pain, somebody's mindset and how they think and feel about perhaps themselves and their abilities?
Well, if you want to, Peter O'Sullivan is the leading researcher on this subject. And I don't remember where he is. He's got like 200 research papers out there. Have not read them all. But he's worked with people that have been in tremendous pain and just talked to them for a while, gotten them to realize that if you're in chronic pain, what's happening to your body is not necessarily damaging. Your body, your brain is feeling some pain and you're guarding it as a result. You're afraid of what's going on because you're not really sure of what's going on. And so it keeps manifesting and building on top of itself. You keep getting more and more pain just because your brain thinks it's bad.
Right.
but it really isn't. So I've watched him talk to people who haven't been able to bend over at all, and then just have them bend over and touch the floor without any pain, just by getting them to alter the mindset. So movement I believe movement plays a big role for people who are active, because he seems to work with more of a sedentary crowd, people that aren't exercising at all. But for people in our program, we really help them to understand this concept that their chronic pain has been there for years. They're not going to do anything that's going to just destroy their body. It's not like you're getting hit by a car, falling down the stairs, and breaking a bone, for instance. Those are things where your life could be in danger, for instance.
Sure, of course.
In that case, the pain and the amount of pain you're feeling is reasonable. But for chronic pain and injuries, it's not, you shouldn't be afraid of it at all. You want to play with it. The problem is people don't know what to do. They're not sure that they're making progress in the right direction.
Sure.
And that's what we're kind of helping people with in the Instagram or in our program.
You're trying to help people shift where their thought processes are in relation to their pain, was they probably learned, as you suggested, habits of, I can't do this because it hurts. And you're trying to help them realize that actually there's probably a lot more that they can do than they realize.
Exactly. And then people tend to focus on things that they cannot control. For instance, you can't control how much pain you're in. You can't control the weather outside. You can't control the time. What you can control is how much sleep you get, what kind of inflammatory foods you're eating, the types of exercise you're doing. If you're still trying to deadlift and you have back pain, that's something you can control. You can go back down and work on more fundamental movements. Problem is, people don't necessarily know what those movements are. And they're not sure if they're going to help. What are we doing on time?
Yeah, we're good. I'm just thinking in terms of, do you try then to edge on and encourage them with like small steps forward, or is it mostly about helping them reframe their thought processes?
So we do small steps, because that seems to give people the most, I don't like to use this word hope, it gives people more hope to feel that, oh wow, I can do pelvic tilts, loosening up my back, my pain kind of went down just from doing that. And then throughout the process, we get them to alter the types of words they're using. People want to use the words try, can't, but, hope, wish, without, and they use the word pain in everything that they say, eliminating those words from your thought process altogether.
Yeah, sure.
And then also working with people on visualization. So getting them to visualize how the movement should look based on what they've been learning, what they're seeing. How does it look there? How can I visualize my body doing it, and then practicing it?
Oh,
so visualization is powerful in every sport.
I really like that. I think that's really helpful, actually, helping them change the words they use, create new habits, which will then help to evolve their thoughts. And as they evolve their thoughts, they'll help to evolve the way they feel about that pain, and perhaps build their confidence to move forward. It's really helpful stuff there. Really helpful.
Yes. It's more of a lifestyle change than just movement. It applies more to everything in life than just movement and your pain. And that seems to be the case for people.
I think over here in sort of the low back management approach, they sort of refer to that as the biopsychosocial model, where you're trying to change the way you think and your environment around about you so that you feel more positive about the way you're managing that pain.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful. Last question then. And that is, if I could take you back in time to a week or two before you did your back injury, all right, and you were able to give yourself a bit of advice, one bit of advice, what would you tell yourself at this stage years later?
The one, I think I saw this on the sheet, what is your favorite exercise or something like that. It would have been abdominal bracing, core bracing. That's the first thing that I learned from my original CrossFit coach was bracing. I learned a lot of movements from him, actually. And when I learned how to do that bracing and finding a neutral spine and maintaining it in every movement that I did, it allowed my body to heal. Yeah. And before that, my spine was doing so much work and I had this herniation. It was just flopping the whole time, could never heal. It was like taking a knife and just reopening a wound over and over and over. Whereas the bracing would stabilize it and allow my spine to heal. So I would have done that first and foremost, even if I didn't have an idea of hip hinging, because I would figure it out.
Yeah, nice one. So teaching yourself to brace the spine would have been helpful for you.
Super helpful. I had no idea how to do that.
All right, fantastic. Hey, Andrew, it's been such a pleasure to spend some time with you today. I appreciate
That's awesome.
getting up early in the US and coming onto the podcast for us.
Early, it's 9.
Well, yeah, I forgot you're a 6 o'clock guy, so it's all good. Of course, we'll connect up all our listeners with you guys on MoveU and through Instagram and all the other channels and ways of connecting with you, Andrew.
Perfect. I appreciate that.
And it would be really, really great perhaps in the future to have you guys back on the show.
Thanks for having me, dude.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.